The following was recorded at Web Direction South in Sydney on October the 9th, 2009. For more materials from this conference series, please visit webdirections.org. This podcast is licensed to you under a Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 3.0 license. Please include this audio license notice with any copy or derivative work of the podcast that you distribute. Welcome to Kevin Yank's presentation, CSS Frameworks.
Hello. Hey, good. Welcome back. How was lunch? Nice full room, and it's a warm room. I'm glad. So we're here to talk about CSS frameworks, and I'll just turn my slideshow back on. Here we go. CSS frameworks. Jeff Croft, who spoke at this conference last year, defined CSS frameworks as a set of tools, libraries, conventions, and best practices that attempt to abstract routine tasks into generic modules that can be reused. In short, taking advantage of code reuse when it comes to CSS. So under this admittedly broad definition, who in the room uses a CSS framework in their day-to-day work? All right. And who uses a framework that maybe they wrote themselves? You've got some code that you always start with when you start a new project. You don't start from scratch. Good. So put together, that's most of the people in this room. So maybe you don't need me, but if you look at this definition and then you go out on the web, as I did, and try and look for all the CSS frameworks that are out there, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands. And I'm not going to look at all of them today. My job today is to give you a representative sample, a grand tour of CSS frameworkery, if you will. And I'm going to be looking to answer these three questions. What do CSS frameworks do for you? How can I choose, or how should I choose a CSS framework if I'm going to use one? And finally, are CSS frameworks pure evil? I'm not going to try and compete with Dimitri's hatred of the canvas tag. I don't hate CSS frameworks, but I'll admit there are times that they're the wrong choice, and we'll look at the controversy surrounding that. So, to answer those three questions, we'll be looking at four different types of CSS framework. And the first of these is the humble CSS reset. Now, for those who don't know, a CSS reset, if you use one, should be the first style sheet that you apply to any page that you work on. Its job is to take the built-in styles that come with every browser and remove them, override them, so that what you get is this really plain page. All the headings, all the tables, all the lists, they all revert as much as possible to just plain text, a single line height, single font size, so that you then have this blank canvas in every browser that's the same that you can then work from in your own style work. So this is the code of a very popular CSS reset. This, for anyone keeping count, is the YUI, Yahoo User Interface Library, CSS reset. And it starts out by resetting the margin and padding of a whole bunch of elements to 0. Don't worry if you can't read the code close up. That's the most important thing about this. But it goes on to do a whole bunch of other interesting stuff that you might not think of. Even if you spent half a day writing your own CSS reset at the start of a project, you might not get quite the attention to detail here. It does really important stuff. And it's a lot better than this CSS reset that I see a lot of developers write for themselves, which simply resets the margin and padding of everything to 0. And that actually breaks certain form elements and other things. Really, if you're using open source code like a CSS reset, you're benefiting from the hard work of a lot of other people who maybe had a lot more time to think about this than you do on any given project. So there are a couple of CSS resets out there, and as far as I could tell, these are the two most popular, the YUI that we just looked at, and Eric Meyer's Reset CSS style sheet. And if you stop and compare these two, the differences are actually quite subtle. The nice thing about a CSS reset is the code is pretty short, so you can, if you know your CSS, you can actually read through it and decide for yourself if you agree with what it's doing. The YUI reset leaves a lot of critical styles alone that the Eric Meyer CSS style sheet resets. Things like the focus outline. When you tab through. When you're using keyboard navigation, you tab through a page and you get these dotted outlines around elements in the page. That's the focus outline. And Eric Meyer's reset turns it off with the assumption that you're going to style your own focus outline or focus indicator of some kind later on. It also unstyles certain critical styles, as I call them, things like the insert element, the INS tag. It's underlined by default in most browsers. Eric Meyer turns that off, again, assuming you're going to find your own way to indicate that this text has been inserted. The YUI reset, it resets a lot of default font styles. Things like the strong tag, the emphasis tag, that are bold and italic by default, respectively. It resets those to font style normal and font weight normal. And you might think that that's a natural thing for a CSS reset to do, but it can actually be a little annoying, because if you've applied this reset and then later on you decide to make your headings bold, so you make H1 bold, but you've got an H1 on your page that also has a strong element in it, by default, unless you style it otherwise, that strong is not going to be bold, even though the heading that contains it is, because this CSS reset resets strong to not be bold. It no longer inherits from its parent. Eric Meyer believes the right thing to do is to inherit from your parent. And so not reset strong to normal. You should reset strong to inheriting from its parent. And ideally, that's what you would do, but IE6 and Internet Explorer 7 don't support inherit. So in the earlier versions of his style sheet, he did use inherit anyway and just said, look, it's not going to look quite the same in Internet Explorer 6 and 7. He's since come around to thinking that if the point of a CSS reset is to give you a level playing field, a consistent starting point, it should be as consistent as possible, so he just leaves those styles alone. Strong is still bold and emphasis is still italic after you apply Eric Meyer's reset. So when I look at these, the YUI style sheet, which resets those styles that I just mentioned, that really bugs me. I don't know if it's just me, but that rubs me the wrong way. Resetting those so that they interfere with heading styles later on, I can't stand that. But Eric Meyer's also not perfect. That focus outline is really important, especially to accessibility. And to break the accessibility of your site by default, just by applying a CSS reset, is also a little dangerous. So based on this information alone, if you had to pick a CSS reset today, who would choose YUI? All right, and who would choose Eric Meyer's? A lot more hands. All right. I actually agree. I choose Eric Meyer's, but with the caveat that you really have to know what it does. You can't choose Eric Meyer's and then not read the code. You can't throw it in and just go, all right, I'm sure it's doing something good for me. Because of this accessibility issue, you really do have to read the code. And it has comments in there saying, warning, this turns off the outline, the focus outline. You need to provide your own. If you're looking for a CSS reset that you can fire and forget, that you can just put in there and not worry about the code, Yahoo's is a lot better, because its downside is right there in your face. If it affects you, you're going to see it as a designer. And it's not something you can easily forget about. So I started with the CSS reset for a very good reason, and that's because the controversy around it is the controversy that surrounds all CSS frameworks in microcosm. People disagree over whether you should use a CSS reset at all. This is Jonathan Snook from a blog post called No CSS Reset. He says, the problem I've had with these resets is that I then find myself declaring much more than I ever needed to just to get browsers back to rendering things the way I want. As it turns out, I'm perfectly happy with how a number of elements render by default. I like lists to have bullets and strong elements to have bolded text. And so he's arguing that all a CSS reset does is make you write more code. Eric Meyer, of course, takes the opposite view. He says, I don't want to take style effects for granted. It makes me think just that little bit harder about the semantics of my document. With the reset in place, I don't pick strong because the design calls for bold facing. Instead, I pick the right element, whether it's strong or emphasis or bold or H3 or whatever, and then I style it as needed. So here's an argument that CSS reset, the most important thing it does for you is makes you mindful about your own markup. It's about HTML quality. So you have to decide for yourself whether you're persuaded by one argument or the other, and decide whether a CSS reset is something you should add to your mix. The next type of framework that I want to discuss is grid frameworks. And this is the type of framework that most people think of when you say CSS frameworks. And it turns out there are actually two types of grid frameworks. The first one we'll discuss is column grids. So these are the three of the major column grids. It turns out there's more types of grid frameworks than there are any other kind of CSS framework. But Blueprint CSS, the 960 grid system, and the Yahoo user interface libraries grid CSS. And when you go to the sites for these frameworks and start reading about them and trying to decide which one is right for you, the bullet points that you'll find, the features that are mentioned and the differences that are called out between them are largely meaningless. And I'll come back to that. But what's really important in this table, you know, the width, the number of columns, it's actually pretty meaningless. The bottom row is what's important here. Whether it comes with good documentation, whether the HTML code that you end up writing for your site is the kind of code that you like. And also some of the more subtle differences, like whether it lets you do fixed width layouts or fluid layouts. So let's look at a couple of these frameworks. This is the Blueprint CSS default grid. And don't worry about squinting at those numbers. That's what I'm here for. The Blueprint CSS framework gives you a 24-column grid by default. And each grid column is 30 pixels wide, and there's a 10-pixel gutter between each column. And that all adds up to a 950-pixel wide layout. And it's all in pixels, so it's only fixed width. So let's lay out a page using this grid. We start with a div element, or whatever other more semantically meaningful element you want to use as a container. If you're writing HTML5, this might be a section or an article, something like that. And you've set class equals container on it. And that invokes the Blueprint framework. And then we want to put a header across the top of the page. So we'll use another div tag, let's say, with a class of span-24. And that tells that class, like the container class, is provided by the Blueprint framework, and it tells the div element to span the entire width of the page. Then we want a content area, and we'll give it a span of 18 grid units, and a sidebar with a span of 6 units. And we also have to add a second class to this, the last class. And that tells Blueprint not to put a margin to the right of it. So every time you do a row of multiple grid boxes, the last one has to have the last class on it. So now inside the content area, we want to get a bit fancy. We'll put a feature box. This is a div inside the content div. And we'll set its class to span 9, so it's 9 grid units wide. And another feature box, which is span 9. And again, we put last because it's the last one in its row. You may notice that the site header didn't have last on it. And that's because it's 24 grid units wide. Blueprint is smart enough to know that something that's 24 grid units wide is going to fill the whole grid, so you don't have to be redundant and put last. I'll do a body content area. It's span 18, and it's also last, even though it's the only one in its row. And a few departments along the bottom. Each one spans 6, and again, the last class on the last box. And that's how you use the Blueprint layout framework. The 960 grid system is pretty similar, except that it gives you 2 different grids to choose from by default. So the top one has 18 grid units, and the bottom one has 12 grid units. So you get to choose between grid units that are 60 pixels wide and grid units that are 40 pixels wide. And the gap between them now is 20 pixels. And all this adds up to 960 pixels, which might make you think it's 10 pixels better than Blueprint. But if you're counting pixels, you'll notice that the outer edges of this layout are actually not content area. Now they're margins, they're gutter. So if anything, 960 grid system is 10 pixels worse than Blueprint, if you're counting pixels. So again, we'll start by putting up a container. And this time you have to put container underscore 16 to tell it which of these 2 grids you want to use. We're going to use the 16-column grid. And we'll put a site header of 16 grid units. And we'll put a content area of 12 grid units. You'll notice it uses underscores instead of hyphens. That's a stylistic choice. A sidebar of 4 grid units. Now, what's missing here is the last. The 960 grid system doesn't require you to use last, and that, again, has to do with those outer gutters. It just puts a gutter on everything, and so you don't have to be special and mention the last one. But what you do have to do is, it comes when you want to put nested grid elements. So now let's fill in that content area. What you have to do, instead of just putting last, you have to put alpha on the first one in each row and omega on the last one in each row. Now, I'm a Star Trek fan, and even to me, these names are wanky. But there you have it. It saves you a little work if you're doing a very simple grid that's just one level deep, but as soon as you start nesting grid units, you got to put classes all over the place. That middle one, the body content that you think would be simplest, grid 12, alpha, omega, it's both. It's amazing. It's a lot of typing. So the third one that I wanted to look at is the YUI grid. And it actually provides this really nice online tool for laying out your grid visually, which is nice because the code that it generates is atrocious. This is the code for that page that we were just looking at, and I'll call out a few things that really bug me. You have to put an ID of doc3 to say that you want this to be a fluid width page. Doc3 means 100% width, apparently. YUI-T6 tells it that you want a 300 pixel wide right sidebar. YUIG is for a 2-column subgrid. YUIGB is for a 3-column subgrid. These names are meaningless, and I find them really hard to remember. If you're going to use the visual layout tool and then never touch your HTML code again, great, but I like a little more meaning in my code, personally. But the big thing that really gets me about YUI grids is that for fixed width things that are going to be fixed pixel widths, it actually uses M units to describe them. Now, this is a clever choice they've made. The advantage here is that if you increase the text size in your browser, the size of your grid gets bigger to accommodate it. And it's a real technical achievement that they've been able to do that. But it really causes the framework to fight against you as soon as you want to do something a little special. If you want to overlap 2 grid units slightly so you can do a special border effect between them, that kind of thing, the types of polish that you'll usually want to do after you've done your initial layout is virtually impossible with the YUI grids framework, which is why I tend to avoid it. But all these issues aside, is anyone in the room annoyed by all of the code that we've seen so far? Does anyone want to tell me what annoys them about it? All right. Presentational class names, non-semantic classes, is what really bugs people about these frameworks on the surface. We've seen all of these things in the code so far. These class names, span9, grid_6, refer to the presentation, how this page should look, and it's going in the HTML code. If we look at the standards surrounding this, HTML4 actually doesn't have a lot to say. I'm not even going to bother reading it out. I think it was written before anyone cared about these things. It basically says you can use the class attribute to apply styles to your site. The HTML5 draft, I have to give them credit, is a lot better on this front. It says authors may use any value in the class attribute, but are encouraged to use values that describe the nature of the content rather than values that describe the desired presentation of the content. Now maybe you're saying, this is a draft. Hopefully it'll change before it goes to the final standard. Or, maybe I'm writing HTML4, so what they say in HTML5 doesn't apply to me. I can break the rules. But there actually is some guidance for HTML4 authors from the W3C as well. This is from a QA note. These are little tips that are really hard to find on the W3C site. But they say, good names don't change. Think about why you want something to look a certain way, and not really about how it should look. Looks can always change, but the reasons for giving something a look stay the same. So in short, you should really be looking for class names that are more meaningful than just describing your desired layout. And this one reason is why a lot of people stay away from CSS frameworks. But we can actually get around it. So here comes the coding demo. This is an actual web page that has the same layout as the one we were just discussing before. And here is the code for it. And as you can see, it contains a lot of these presentational classes, span 24, span 18. I've done this in Blueprint, by the way. So we're going to find these classes that we don't want, and we're going to go through and remove them all. There we go. All right, and as I did that, the layout on the right just sort of fell apart, which is what you'd expect, because I've removed all of these classes that control the layout. What we're left with are classes that are actually quite meaningful: department, feature, body, content. These are the kind of classes that we'd like to keep in our document and hang the styles off of. So if I switch back to Safari here and refresh that, there's the broken layout. And now, this is a script I'm going to show you that comes with the Blueprint CSS framework. It's called compress.rb. It's a clever little Ruby script. And what it lets you do when you run it is compile your own custom version of Blueprint. And you can control, with a little configuration file, all sorts of things about it. You can control the number of columns. You can control their width, their spacing between them. If you want more than 950 pixels, you can get it. But what it also lets you do is assign your own class names to things within the framework. So I'm editing the config file on the left here, and something I prepared earlier. This code says things like the header and footer classes should actually be span 24. The content class should be span 18. We're mapping between our own classes and the ones provided by the Blueprint framework. And then we will run the script. And now I've just recompiled the Blueprint framework. It's compressed it down after applying my own custom classes to it. Now if I switch back to my editor, oh, hang on. If I switch back to the page we were looking at before, there we go, and refresh it, the layout is back. And I'll go back to my browser and refresh that too. We've got our layout back. And there's no presentational code in this HTML file at all. So just like that, we can dispel the biggest objection that most people have to CSS frameworks. And there are a lot of articles out there that are still complaining about this issue. And it's easy to go and read one and go, I'm never going to use CSS frameworks. But they're listening. The people who write these frameworks are people like you and me. They care about this stuff as much as we do. And they're making progress. Another annoyance that a lot of people have, and this is a term coined by Andy Clark, who we've heard a bit from in this conference already. He says that using a framework like Blueprint CSS or any of the other layout frameworks that we've looked at puts you in a mind of presentational thinking as you're writing your HTML code, when you should really be thinking about semantics, the meaning in your document. He contends that you should write your HTML with a pure mind that doesn't even consider how this page is going to look at the end of the day, and that using a framework like this fights against that. I don't buy this. I think that if you're the kind of person who cares about your code, well, if you're the kind of person who doesn't care about your HTML code, you're just going to use one of these things, obviously. If you're the kind of person who does care about these codes, whether you try and purge your mind of presentational thoughts or not, the code that you're going to end up with to achieve a given layout is probably going to look pretty similar. Whether you start thinking presentationally and then clean up your code because you care about that sort of thing, or whether you do the Andy Clark thing, the code's going to look pretty similar. I don't think HTML is that complicated a language that the approach you take is going to affect the finished result. So I don't buy that argument. So coming back to these three choices, and I've added semantic classes as a big benefit of Blueprint there with that script that it comes with. I actually choose Blueprint CSS as long as you can live with a fixed width layout. Or if you're just doing some rapid prototyping, it's good for that too. The 960 grid system, the documentation is not quite as good, I find. And there are still customization tools for changing the width and gutter and that sort of thing. But I like Blueprint a little better. It's more comprehensive and it has this nice script. YUI for the reasons I mentioned earlier, the ugly code, the fact that the framework ends up fighting you. I would recommend staying away from it. If you need to do fluid width layout, I still recommend coding that yourself. But you can see why these top two rows, I told you not to pay any attention to them. The number of columns, the number of pixels width, all that stuff is customizable now. Choosing a framework based on this sort of thing, and I've literally read people saying, I choose 960 grid system because I like more air in my layout, and the gutter was twice as big. It's equivalent to choosing an operating system based on the default desktop background. So really, take the time, or, ask me. The second kind of grid framework we're going to look at is typographic grids. And typographic grids are largely concerned with creating vertical rhythm on a page. So this layout grid we've got on the right is something you might switch on during the design process. And the idea here is to get all of your text to match this even grid. And it increases readability and the level of polish that your users will perceive, if only in the back of their minds. So this is the typographic grid that comes with Blueprint CSS. It's really a do-everything framework. It sets up a default font size of 12 pixels and a default leading or line height of 18 pixels. And it doesn't do them with pixels. I've just done that for the convenience of our conversation. You don't have to worry about issues surrounding pixel font sizes with Blueprint. So here's what it does. For H1, it sets a font size of 3 ems, a line height of 1, and a margin bottom of 0.5 ems. And they've done a bit of math to figure out that a 3M font size, so 12 pixel default font size times 3 ems times 1 line height gives you 36 pixels, which is 2 of these 18 pixel grid units. So every line of the heading 1 will take up 36 pixels, 2 grid units exactly. And then the margin underneath the heading is 12 pixels times 3 ems times 0.5 ems for the margin bottom, 18 pixels, exactly 1 grid margin. So what they're doing here, they're doing some math to get everything to take up a whole number of grid units. So a heading 2 is done with similar math. You again get 2 grid units per line, even though you've got a smaller font size. And they do that by increasing the line height to 1.5. The margin again is 1 grid unit. And a heading 3, again, a smaller font size. This time, they go back to a line height of 1, which gives you a single grid unit, and again, a 1 grid unit margin underneath. So when you complete this process, you end up with layouts that look kind of like this. And again, if you squint your eyes, you can see the subtle, the faint grid that I've put behind there. But everything, even between these 2 columns, everything lines up within that grid. And that's what you're going for with a typographic grid framework. But there's a way this could be improved even better. Are there any designers in the audience who'd like to take a stab at how this could be made better? Yep. Baseline. Exactly. This is what we want. And if you blinked and missed it, this is the effect you get from a new framework called the Baseline CSS framework. And it's a more advanced typographic grid. I'll give you a close-up of the difference. This is before. You'll notice the ordered list heading, even though it's in the same grid line as the text next to it, it doesn't line up. What you want as a designer is the bottom of all the letter forms to share a common baseline. And that's what the Baseline framework does for you. And the way this is done is they apply some relative positioning to every single element in HTML to subtly shift things up and down so that they line up perfectly. It even does these for the text inside of form fields. It's really incredible. But if you're not a fan of pixel font sizes, you want to stay far away from Baseline CSS because that's how it does this. Again, there are naysayers who question the value of typographic grids. And we come back to Andy Clark here, who has done a lot of work about debunking the enthusiasm about CSS frameworks. So he points out that the ideal leading, the ideal line spacing for a design is dependent on a lot of factors. First of all, your choice of font. Here on the left, we've got Helvetica, and on the right, we've got Calibri. And Calibri is a font that has a smaller X height, which is to say its lowercase letters as a ratio to the uppercase letters are smaller than Helvetica. And as a result, the line spacing here ends up being too much for this layout. So if you use a font like Calibri and then use one of these prepackaged typographic grids, you'll end up with a layout that has too much air in it. It's difficult to read as a result. Another issue is serifs on fonts. So on the left, again, we have Helvetica, but on the right, we have Times, which has little protrusions at the ends of the letter forms. They call them serifs. And serifs help the eye scan a line of text. And when you have a serifed font, you usually want less leading. So you want to compress your lines more. And again, we end up, if we use a prepackaged typographic framework, we end up with lines that are too spaced apart. And then we have issues like colors. A light text against dark background is harder for the eye to scan. It's a noisier image. It's a little sharper. And as a result, you want to create more leading. You want to breathe more air into your layout. So whatever the issue, even the typical length of lines in your layout comes into play here. There are a lot of factors that go into choosing how much air you want in your text. And as a result, using a prepackaged framework that maybe wasn't designed with your font in mind, maybe wasn't designed with your colors in mind, can be a bad idea. I recommend, personally, I'm not the kind of designer who spends all day tweaking my fonts to work exactly right, just because I'm a developer. And if I, as a developer, without the help of a talented designer, needs to get a site up and looking professional, I will use a typographic grid, probably because I'm going to be using default fonts. If, however, you're the kind of designer who has the attention to detail that we saw in the baseline grid, where everything lined up against the same line, you probably want to design your own typographic grid, I would say, and not use one of these prepackaged ones. The third type of framework is a quick one. It's called a CSS prefab, and that's just what I call them. And that's what I call ready-made styles for documents that are made of prescribed components. I'm thinking of things like some of the more intricate skins that you can download for WordPress. They'll often contain a bunch of styles that they then expect you to take advantage of by using particular patterns of HTML code. Here's another example of a CSS prefab. This is a library called SlickMap CSS. And if you never, ever want to go through the soul-crushing process of designing your client's sitemap, then you should download this, because it is a ready-made style sheet for sitemaps. And then all you have to do is put in your page a hierarchical list of links, and it styles them just like this in a really nice flowchart sort of layout. And this is, you can customize the colors if you want to, but it's so much less work than spending, a whole day and a whole night on a page of the site that the Google search engine is only ever going to look at. So CSS prefabs are real time savers, but clearly they're not tools for original design. But Andy Clark, the perpetual naysayer, actually thinks there's a good use for CSS frameworks here. And this is a screenshot from a site called The New Internationalist that he designed recently, where his client needed to have this area at the top of the page that could have different layouts from one month to the next, based on what they wanted to highlight at the top of the page. And rather than risk them going in and changing the HTML code to achieve these styles, throwing in style attributes everywhere, killing your dreams with all of the carefully validated code you wrote, he provided a simple CSS framework that they could use to achieve these styles. So here we've got the code for this layout. It's V6-9-9, and those numbers refer to the relative widths of things. And the next month, maybe they want this, and they go to V9-6.9. So Andy has prepared all of these styles in advance and then given them a little guide of the code they should use to achieve different layouts. And so he's really written a little CSS framework for them here. And it's code they can understand even as they're editing the HTML. Now, yes, it's putting presentational code into your HTML, but given the alternative, once you deliver the code to your client, they're going to wreck it. So why not have them wreck it in the best possible way? So that's CSS prefabs. The last type of framework I want to look at has to do with CSS abstraction. And I had a long night trying to find a photo to represent abstraction, let me tell you. So apologies if this doesn't push your buttons. This was my second choice. I love a good programmer joke. So CSS abstraction. Before I get to this quote, abstraction, I'm thinking about the jQuery framework here and what it did for JavaScript. And not just jQuery, but all of the other frameworks out there. What they did is provide tools that take thousands of lines of obscure JavaScript and compress them down to a single function call so that developers are empowered to do so much more with their JavaScript code. And wouldn't it be great if we could do the same thing with CSS frameworks? But CSS frameworks don't provide the kinds of tools for abstraction that programmers need to do that. And so there have been several proposals to add things like variables to CSS. And Bert Boss, one of the co-creators of CSS, has this to say about those efforts. He said, adding any form of macros or additional scopes and indirections, including symbolic constants, is not just redundant, but changes CSS in ways that make it unsuitable for its intended audience. Given that there is currently no alternative to CSS, these things must not be added. This boils down to CSS is simple. Let's keep it that way. He thinks CSS should be a language that you don't have to be a programmer to understand, which I suppose is fair enough. So what are we to do? Well, that's what we have server-side frameworks for. And server-side frameworks give you extra language features on top of CSS, and then the framework compiles it back to standard CSS that the browser can understand. So there's a few examples here. This is probably the most prominent one right now. It comes from the Ruby on Rails world. So there's a language called Sass, which is this language that gives you more features on top of what you get with CSS. And then a framework called Compass. So at the top here, we have some sample Sass code. And we're defining two variables here, site point background and site point foreground. They're two different colors. And then we want to create a rule. So the header, the element with ID header, will have a background color of site point background. And we can reuse that color as many times as we want. And if we ever want to change it, we only have to change it in one place. We can do nested selectors with a nicer syntax here. So this A link is actually links inside of the header element. And we give them a color of site point foreground. And then visited links, we give them a color of site point foreground minus the color 830. So we can even do arithmetic using colors here. And that's the Sass language. And what the Compass framework does is adds to this the power of all of these other frameworks that we've already looked at. The Blueprint CSS, the 960 grid system, YUI grids. It builds in all of these frameworks so that we can customize them and use them right in our own style sheets. So here we're saying import Blueprint CSS. That says I want to use the Blueprint framework. And then we customize it with a few variables. The Blueprint grid columns, 16. So we want a 16-unit grid. What we're doing here is customizing the Blueprint CSS framework so that it has the same dimensions as the 960 grid system by default. We then just do plus Blueprint grid, and that's what's called a mix-in. And what that does is it magically expands to all of the styles that are defined by the Blueprint framework with these customizations applied. But better than that is not to use that line. Instead, as we did before, we'll apply the styles to our own markup. So the container will have plus container. So that's going to apply the styles of a Blueprint container. The header element will have column 16, so it should occupy 16 columns of width. And you can go through your style sheet writing it like that. It expands to standard CSS. Clever CSS is for the Python crowd. It's got a lot of the same features. In fact, as far as I can tell, all of the same features as the Sass language. What it lacks is these mix-ins for using the common frameworks. So if you're a Python guru, get to work. You got some catching up to do. The PHP crowd, though, are really well served by a framework called Scaffold, which is written by a fellow who's sitting right back there, I think, Anthony Short from Sydney. Round of applause for Anthony. So Scaffold is an open source framework for the PHP, and it does the same sorts of things as Compass, but I actually like the syntax better. It's more like standard CSS, which means if you find yourself switching back and forth between the two, there's less mental gears that you have to shift to do that. So again, we can define a couple of constants. We can set a background color from one of those constants. We can nest selectors. And the one thing it lacks is the arithmetic to do with colors. It does arithmetic with everything else. I actually find that that's not a feature I use in practice. At first, I thought it was a missing feature, but turns out it's just as quick to define your dark color and your light color at the top of your style sheet and than to try and work out the math of how to make your light color into a dark color. On the right here, we can then set up a grid with our own customizations. And again, we apply container and the column count to our code. So that's server-side frameworks. Which brings us back to the three questions that we started with. What do CSS frameworks do? Well, as we've seen, CSS frameworks reset styles. They give us tools to lay out our page using a grid and match up our text using a typographic grid. They give us prefabs that save us work on the parts of our design that we don't feel are worth doing original design for. And they make CSS more powerful using these server-side frameworks that add features that programmers will really appreciate. How do you choose a CSS framework? Well, I don't recommend adopting a CSS framework because it's free code that you don't have to write. I mean, it is that. But really, you should adopt a CSS framework because it's code you agree with. It's code that you've read, you've understood, and you've realized, man, on my best day, I might write that code. Because dozens of other developers have put their heads together and found all of the flaws and made it perfect as far as you're concerned. You should adopt the code that you agree with. What you're doing by adopting a CSS framework is buying into a shared methodology with all of the benefits that that includes. So you're getting a community that you can discuss issues with because you do things the same way. You're getting shared documentation that you can contribute to rather than having to write it from scratch. You're getting benefits with recruitment. You can put on a job ad, knows Blueprint CSS, and then you know that the candidates that are walking in the door write CSS code that is compatible with the way you do things at your company. Are CSS frameworks pure evil? Well, of course they're not. It's a shortcut. CSS frameworks are shortcuts, and shortcuts can be good or bad. They can save you a lot of time, or they can end you up stuck in the mud on some back road. There is no need with CSS to reinvent the wheel every time, but you should make it your business to be an expert in whatever wheel you choose to use, whether you designed it yourself or not. And that's the takeaway here. If you adopt a CSS framework, these frameworks are not as imposing as they may seem at first glance. You can get through the code of one even as complicated as Blueprint in an afternoon and decide for yourself whether that's the kind of code you want in your projects. So that's the answer to the three questions. How much time do I have left? I've got a few minutes, actually. So I'll go through these last slides, and then I'll take some questions. Some final thoughts about CSS frameworks. There's a lot of concern over the bulk that they add to your sites. Some of these things, especially things like Blueprint that are all-encompassing and give you lots of features, there's concern about the amount of code that you're adding to your site here. So these are some things you should always be doing with CSS, but they're especially important when you come to frameworks. You should combine your style sheets together so that as much as possible you have a single link tag in your head. Or more practically, you probably have a link tag for the screen style sheet, a link tag for the print style sheet, and one for Internet Explorer. But apart from having those three, you should combine things together as much as possible. In development, you can have them separate. If you've got a server-side guru who can wrangle that for you, keep them separate in development, and then when you deploy the site, they should be combined together. This reduces the number of HTTP requests required to load a site and really speeds things up. You should strip out styles that your site doesn't use. So if you're just using the grid part of Blueprint and you want to leave the typography and all the other things that are in it alone, you should strip out those styles. There's a tool called Dust Me Selectors. We give it away for free at SitePoint, and it's a Firefox add-on that will actually scan your site and its style sheets and point out the selectors that are never referenced, the ones that don't match anything on your site. And these are probably styles that either they're part of a framework that you're not using, or they're old styles that have become obsolete that you really want to pull out. And finally, shrink your style sheets. CSS, as you write it, depending on your coding style, will often have a lot of extra white space and line breaks For readability, you want to strip that out as much as possible to reduce the size of your style sheets. And there's a free tool called CSS Tidy that I recommend you look up. You can feed it your style sheets, and it'll spit out a minified style sheet, as they call it. But the server-side tools that we looked at mostly do all this stuff for you. So if you're using Compass, if you're using Scaffold, most of this work is done for you. Finally, there's been some controversy about the concept of CSS frameworks being seen as training wheels. We posted a blog post about this on SitePoint, and the commenters were up in arms. We said that CSS frameworks can make it easier for a beginner to learn CSS, mostly because they don't have to be faced with that ugly first page when they first start learning CSS. They can use the tools that are provided by a framework. And this was seen as us saying that you don't need to learn CSS in depth. You only need to learn the framework. I really don't want to say that. On every project, CSS, it's a really important part of the web. And on any project, you really need someone who understands CSS in depth, obviously. But on a project with a large team, where you may got content editors who are dabbling in your CSS code to do specific style things, maybe they don't need to understand CSS in depth. Maybe they can operate at the level of a framework. And Nicole Sullivan talked about this in her talk, Object-Oriented CSS at Web Directions North earlier this year. The video is online for free, and I recommend you check it out. And she talked about how she had a big team, a big project, and it was stalling because they couldn't find CSS experts to hire to put on the team. So what she did is put in a very deliberate series of training steps that new hires could go into. They could join the team as a CSS beginner and over time progress to a CSS expert. Finally, when all you have is a hammer, everything does tend to look like a nail. And if you adopt one of these CSS frameworks, in a short space of time, you might find yourself thinking of web design in terms of what these frameworks make possible, or even what they make easy. If there's one thing I'd caution you against, is don't let that happen. Remember to think outside the framework. Use Photoshop and design your site with your imagination wide open, and then worry about how you're going to do it in CSS. And make your compromises after you've done your ideal design. Don't fall into the trap of thinking of the web in terms of what CSS frameworks already do today, because as Elliot Stocks just very capably showed in the other room, it's all about pushing the boundaries. So with that, I'll be happy to take your questions.
Hey there, thanks for the speech. My question's about using Ajax and the implications of, like, for instance, variables with colors. What happens then when you change a CSS property using Ajax?
Well, typically what I would do is if I had these two colors, one for a normal state and one for an alert state, for example, and I was changing from one state to another in response to an Ajax request that I'd received a reply to. What that JavaScript code would do is change the class of an element, maybe apply an alert class to it. And so as long as that alert class is defined in your style sheet with that variable applied to the color, you're going to be fine. It's not going to be stripped out. If you use a tool like Dust.me Selectors and you don't take the tool through all those states, it will point out some of those as unnecessary styles, and you might accidentally strip them out. So you do have to watch out when you're stripping out stuff manually. But the server-side frameworks will not pull things out of your page just because they aren't present in the initial state. I think you're perfectly safe there.
All right, thanks.
No worries. We got another over here.
Was a lot of the arguments for variables in CSS coming through from past programmers who are now forced to do CSS, or was it from the ones who were sort of starting with CSS first and going straight through with that, and were sort of really hardcore CSS gurus or whatever?
I don't know if forced is the right word. I'm picturing you holding a programmer's head in the toilet. You will code CSS! I think if you're a developer who has worked on the server side and you're used to those kind of facilities, the limitations of CSS will naturally be frustrating. And definitely, I'm sure a lot of the clamor has come from them. But even if you're a front-end ninja who has had to redeclare the same color once too often, or had to find and replace a color once too often, it's very quickly it doesn't take a programmer to realize, I'd really like to define this once and use it everywhere else. I don't know, to be honest. I haven't taken a poll to find out whether they're coders or designers who are asking for this. I know that an initial implementation came out of Apple. There was a WebKit nightly build that showed how CSS variables could work. And that's what prompted that essay from Bert Boss saying it was a bad idea. But yeah, I think it's something that anyone who works with CSS long enough is going to want. But I'm not sure. Maybe Bert's right. Maybe we can't add those features to the detriment to the people who are learning CSS for the first time. Another question? Right here.
Kevin, when you do CSS reset,
Yeah.
does that affect browser personalization settings for accessibility, like for color blindness, etc.?
No. The question for anyone who didn't hear is whether the CSS reset styles take priority over user-specific styles that you might specify in a browser. Browsers like Opera are especially good at giving some control to users who need it over the default styles in the page. A CSS reset has the same priority as any other styles that you would apply to your site as a designer. And so necessarily, by that logic, anything that a user would normally be able to override, they will still be able to override in the CSS reset. If you're a bad developer, you might put important on some things. But again, I'm pretty sure user-specific styles sit at the very top of the stack, and they override even important styles specified by a developer. So I think it's perfectly safe. Any other questions? Got to do some running.
I've got a question about the comment you made about polluting the semantic layer, if you like, with the styling layer with the grids. Is there any reason why you can't just have a semantic layer that includes those styling layers, if you see what I mean, as the style for them? Am I missing something? I think I'm missing something, which is why you suggested this.
Can you say that again?
So is there any reason why you can't define styles for the semantic layer and then just apply the grids into those, if you see what I mean, and separate it that way? Or I'm probably missing something here.
Apply the grids at, define the semantic layer.
So I define a style for that semantic thing. Say it's, I don't know, my table of dollars or something. So that's the style. Why can't I just apply the grid to that and therefore pull it out?
Well, that's where the lack of abstraction tools in CSS come in. You would like to be able to say in your style sheet, in your CSS code, body content has a grid width of this.
Yeah.
Or reuse the styles from Blueprint defined over there on this style that I've just defined. The CSS language doesn't have the features to do that. That's where the mix-ins that you get in the server-side frameworks, that's exactly what they do. You do plus something, and that's where you're saying, I want to reuse some logic from somewhere else in my style sheet. I want this style to be this many grid units
I'd only
wide.
ever done it in Rails, so I wasn't kind of aware of why I was doing it that way, I think.
Yeah.
So
well,
now I think I understand why I had to do it that way.
Yeah. So the short answer is CSS does not provide the tools to do that.
So use the server-side thing whenever you need to do
Absolutely.
that. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Any other questions? Right there. Okay, I'll repeat the question for the podcast.
You spoke about the baseline typographic framework, and it looked good, but you said that one of the negative aspects was the fact that it uses pixel sizes.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of accessibility, that's always been historically it's been a no-no to do with resizing, but now that modern browsers, can do the resizing without using the pixel sizes.
Yes. If you came into this room already persuaded that pixel sizes are okay because all modern browsers provide a page zoom that gets around the issue with pixel sizes, then you should walk out of this room with that same conviction, and the Blueprint CSS framework is just fine for you. We learned last year when Jeff Croft made that argument in the main room that a lot of people still disagree with that. There are still a lot of people using Internet Explorer 6 that doesn't have a page zoom, and if those people are a significant amount of your audience, you do need to worry about pixel fonts.
Any chance of a baseline that uses M's or something like that?
You should write one. The question was, the question was whether there's a version of baseline that uses M's. I assume there's a reason he used pixels. Probably it's the only way that insane thing could work. It is amazing what he's done. So, yeah, but definitely some research into doing it with M's would be worthwhile. Another question from the gentleman over here.
Just a sec.
Actually has M-based layout for baselines and things like that.
Which framework is that?
Typogridify.
Typogridify was not on my initial slide because I missed it, so check it out. It may have a typographic grid with M's. There was a question down here. I'm really sorry. Go for it. I'll repeat the question.
Where do you think the future of the framework CSS lies, particularly in terms of things like grid, given that with the advent of CSS3, we're going to have more advanced layout options?
Yes. Where is the future of CSS grid frameworks with CSS3 adding more advanced layout options? I think any good framework will tend towards an empty file over time. Definitely some of the better JavaScript frameworks are designed that way. They add features that we already know are coming, like the CSS query features of things like jQuery. Those features are being added to the core JavaScript, and over time, the framework will be able to defer to the implementation in the browser and go, I'm no longer needed here. I can remove a lot of code. And ideally, the same thing would happen with CSS frameworks. Over time, they will become unnecessary. CSS frameworks are kind of, in a way, an expression of what we find lacking in CSS. And if the standards bodies are paying attention, if the browser developers are paying attention, over time we'll be able to look forward to more CSS frameworks that take us even further into the future. I think there was a question from Lachlan, was there? No?
No more?
All right.
Oh, there's one.
One over here.
I use frameworks a lot and big promoter of them, love them. When you get to large scale sites where you've got a lot of, if you're going to assign semantic class names and then assign them to a grid thing, if you've got things like a whole heap of semantic classes that refer back to the exact same grid layout, aren't you then sort of, I mean, if you get to, say, 30 or 40 of these semantic class names, you're going to have a lot of bloat in your CSS as opposed to just having one class on all of those in the front end and then one reference in the CSS.
Right.
Whereas now you're going to have all the semantic names in the front end, but then, 15 comma-separated values in the CSS file.
I see what you mean. I'm glad you said that there are comma-separated values because, yeah, any good framework will merge those together if they're using the same common styles, and it'll just be a comma-separated list of all of your semantic classes. If there are really so many classes in your content, I would say your problem is really that you're being a little too granular in your markup. You don't need 15 different kinds of alerts if they all have the same style. An alert is an alert then. You would have to have a really, really big project for that to be a real-world problem, I'd say. And if you are working on such a project, congratulations. It sounds exciting. For most of us in this room, I don't think it's an issue.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. For more materials from Web Directions events, please visit webdirections.org.